In the vast expanse of the galaxy where stars burn like ancient beacons across the infinite void, there existed a time before the endless wars that now consume reality itself. Before the thunder of bolter fire echoed through the cosmos, before the shriek of chainswords tore through alien flesh. Before humanity even dreamed of reaching beyond their primitive world, there were beings of such immense power and wisdom that they shaped the very fabric of existence. These were the Old Ones, the first children of the galaxy, masters of life and death, creators and destroyers on a scale that defies mortal comprehension. Tonight, as the darkness settles around you and the weight of the day begins to fade, let us journey back through millions of years to witness the rise and fall of the galaxy's first great civilization. This is not merely a tale of ancient history, but the foundation upon which all future conflicts would be built. Every drop of blood spilled in the grim darkness of the far future can trace its origins back to the choices made by these primordial beings. The Old Ones were not just another alien species. They were the architects of reality as we know it, the gardeners of life itself, and ultimately the unwitting architects of their own destruction. The Old Ones emerged from the primordial chaos of the galaxy's youth, when the stars were younger and the warp flowed calm and serene like a gentle ocean. They were beings of incredible longevity, their lifespans measured not in centuries or millennia but in geological ages. Where other species might experience the rise and fall of civilizations within a single Old One's lifetime, these ancient beings viewed time as mortals might view the changing of seasons. They had the luxury of patience, the gift of foresight, and most importantly, they possessed an understanding of the fundamental forces that governed existence itself. Unlike the crude matter manipulation that would characterize later civilizations, the Old Ones worked with the very essence of life. They were bioengineers on a cosmic scale, capable of seeding entire worlds with life, guiding evolution across millions of years, and crafting species as carefully as an artisan might shape clay. Their technology was not built from metal and circuits, but grown from living tissue, nurtured through psychic communion, and powered by their deep understanding of the warp's gentle currents. They created not just tools and weapons, but entire ecosystems, complete biospheres that could sustain themselves across the eons. The galaxy in those distant days was a far different place than the nightmare realm it would become. The warp, that parallel dimension of thought and emotion that lies beneath reality's skin, was then a realm of tranquility. It flowed like a calm sea, its currents predictable and safe. The Old Ones had learned to navigate these psychic waters with the same ease that a sailor might traverse familiar coastlines. They used the warp not just for travel, but as a tool for creation, drawing upon its energies to fuel their great works. Through the warp, they could reach across vast distances instantaneously, communicate with their scattered colonies, and channel the raw stuff of creation into new forms of life. Their cities were marvels that transcended the boundary between technology and biology. Vast coral-like structures that grew from the living rock of planets, reaching toward the stars like the arms of sleeping giants. These metropolises pulsed with a gentle bioluminescence, their walls breathing with the rhythm of some vast organism. Gardens of impossible beauty stretched between towering spires where plants from 1,000 different worlds grew in perfect harmony. Rivers of liquid light flowed through channels carved from living stone, carrying not water but pure energy that nourished both the city and its inhabitants. The Old Ones themselves were beings of fluid form, their physical bodies capable of adaptation and change as their needs required. Some accounts describe them as amphibian-like creatures, equally at home in water or on land, their skin shifting between scales and smooth flesh as circumstances demanded. Others speak of beings of pure energy, only taking physical form when interaction with the material world required it. The truth, as with so many aspects of the Old Ones, likely encompasses both descriptions and more. They were masters of biological manipulation, and this mastery extended to their own forms as readily as to the species they created. But the Old Ones were not content to remain isolated on their birth world. Their curiosity and their desire to nurture life drove them to spread across the galaxy, seeking out worlds where their gifts could take root. They became the great gardeners of the cosmos, seeding barren planets with the spark of life, guiding the evolution of primitive organisms, and watching with patient satisfaction as their creations flourished. Each world they touched became a unique experiment in biological development, a living laboratory where new forms of life could emerge and thrive. On countless worlds, they planted the seeds that would one day bloom into intelligent species. Some of these children would grow to become mighty civilizations in their own right, while others would remain in more primitive states, content to live simple lives in harmony with their environments. The Old Ones did not seek to control their creations directly, preferring instead to guide them gently, offering wisdom and knowledge to those ready to receive it. They were teachers and guardians, not conquerors or tyrants. Yet even as they spread their influence across the galaxy, the Old Ones maintained a careful balance. They understood that life required diversity to truly flourish, that stagnation was the enemy of growth. They created not one perfect species, but thousands of different forms, each adapted to their particular environment and role in the greater ecosystem of the galaxy. Some were fierce warriors, others gentle scholars, still others were gifted with psychic abilities that allowed them to touch the warp directly. The Old Ones believed that through this diversity, life would find ways to survive and thrive regardless of what challenges the future might bring. Their mastery of the warp allowed them to travel between worlds instantaneously, through a network of portals they called the Webway. This was perhaps their greatest achievement, a labyrinth of tunnels that existed between dimensions, connecting distant points in space without requiring travel through the dangerous depths of the warp itself. The Webway was a marvel of engineering that combined their biological mastery with their psychic abilities, creating corridors of stable reality that could be traversed safely even by those without psychic gifts. Through these passages, the Old Ones could maintain contact with their far-flung colonies, sharing knowledge and resources across the breadth of the galaxy. The construction of the Webway was a project that spanned millions of years, requiring the coordinated efforts of countless Old Ones working in perfect harmony. They grew the tunnels like living things, nurturing them with psychic energy and biological material until they became self-sustaining passages through the void. Each section was carefully planned and executed with multiple redundancies and fail-safes built into the very structure. The Old Ones knew that their creation would need to survive not just the passage of time, but the challenges that would inevitably arise as the galaxy evolved around it. As their civilization reached its peak, the Old Ones turned their attention to one of their most ambitious projects yet. They had long observed that certain species possessed latent psychic abilities, the potential to touch the warp directly and channel its energies. The Old Ones began to deliberately guide the evolution of these species, strengthening their psychic gifts and teaching them to use their abilities responsibly. They believed that psychically gifted species would be better able to defend themselves against future threats, and would serve as guardians of the knowledge the Old Ones had accumulated over the eons. This great work of psychic enhancement was not undertaken lightly. The Old Ones understood the dangers inherent in touching the warp, even in its calm state. They had developed strict protocols and safeguards, teaching their students not just how to use their abilities, but when to refrain from using them. They emphasized the importance of balance, of understanding that great power required even greater responsibility. Their psychic disciples were taught to see themselves not as masters of the warp, but as its servants, channeling its energies for the benefit of all life. Yet even as they worked to create these psychic guardians, the Old Ones could not foresee the consequences of their actions. They had lived so long in a galaxy where they were the undisputed masters that they had forgotten that other forms of life might develop along different paths. While they nurtured biological evolution and psychic development, somewhere in the galaxy's depths, another species was taking a radically different approach to existence. These beings had abandoned flesh entirely, transferring their consciousness into bodies of living metal that promised eternal life at the cost of their souls. The Necrontyr, as they were known, had once been a mortal species like so many others, but unlike the Old One's children, they had been cursed with short, painful lives on a world bathed in the radiation of a dying star. Where other species might have sought to adapt to their environment or find new worlds to colonize, the Necrontyr had turned their genius toward conquering death itself. They had developed technology that could preserve consciousness beyond the death of the body, but at a terrible price. In their quest for immortality, they had lost something essential, something that made life worth living. The contrast between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr could not have been more stark. Where the Old Ones embraced change and growth, the Necrontyr sought stasis and preservation. Where the Old Ones worked with living systems, the Necrontyr created machines of cold perfection. Where the Old Ones saw death as a natural part of the cycle of existence, the Necrontyr viewed it as an enemy to be defeated at any cost. These fundamental differences in philosophy would prove to be irreconcilable, setting the stage for a conflict that would reshape the galaxy forever. For millions of years, the Old Ones continued their great work, unaware of the growing threat that festered in the galaxy's rim. They tended their garden worlds, guided their psychic students, and maintained the Webway that connected their vast civilization. They had achieved something that no species before or since would ever match: a truly stable, sustainable civilization that could endure across geological ages. They had solved the problems of resource scarcity, overpopulation, and environmental destruction that plagued lesser species. They had created a perfect balance between technology and nature, between individual achievement and collective harmony. But perfection, as the Old Ones would learn, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Their very success had made them complacent. Their vast lifespans had given them a perspective that made them slow to recognize immediate threats. They had grown so accustomed to being the galaxy's teachers and guardians that they could not conceive of a species that might reject their guidance entirely. When the first Necrontyr scout ships appeared at the edges of Old One space, they were met not with suspicion or preparation for war, but with the same patient curiosity that the Old Ones had shown to every new species they encountered. The Old Ones approached these metallic visitors with the same gentle wisdom they had offered to countless other species throughout their long stewardship of the galaxy. They saw in the Necrontyr not enemies, but another species to be guided and nurtured. Perhaps these beings, with their advanced technology and obvious intelligence, could be taught the Old Ones' ways. Perhaps they could be shown how to embrace the natural cycles of life and death, how to find meaning in mortality rather than fleeing from it. The Old Ones' representatives extended offers of knowledge, sharing techniques for biological enhancement that could ease the Necrontyr's suffering and extend their natural lifespans in harmony with the galaxy's rhythms. But the Necrontyr delegation listened to these offers with growing resentment. Here were beings who had lived for millions of years, who spoke casually of eons as if they were mere seasons, offering to teach a dying race how to accept death with dignity. The Necrontyr saw not wisdom in the Old One's words, but mockery. They perceived the Old One's longevity not as a natural gift to be celebrated, but as a cosmic injustice that needed to be corrected. Why should these amphibian creatures enjoy endless life while the Necrontyr suffered and died in the span of decades? Why should the galaxy's resources and knowledge be hoarded by a species that had done nothing to earn them except exist longer? The philosophical divide between the two species ran deeper than mere differences of opinion. The Old Ones viewed existence as a tapestry where every thread, no matter how brief, contributed to the overall pattern. They saw beauty in the temporary nature of most life, believing that mortality gave meaning and urgency to existence. The cycle of birth, growth, death, and renewal was not something to be feared but celebrated as the fundamental rhythm of the universe. To them, the Necrontyr's quest for immortality was not just futile but spiritually hollow, a rejection of the very essence that made life precious. The Necrontyr, however, had long ago abandoned such romantic notions. They had watched their greatest minds and most talented individuals wither and die before their potential could be fully realized. They had seen empires rise and fall within the span of a single Necrontyr's lifetime, their achievements lost to the inexorable march of time. To them, the Old Ones' philosophy was the luxury of beings who had never faced true mortality, never felt the desperate urgency of a ticking clock counting down their remaining moments. The Necrontyr had concluded that death was not a teacher or a friend, but the ultimate enemy, and they were determined to defeat it regardless of the cost. As the initial diplomatic contacts continued, the tension between the two species grew more pronounced. The Old Ones, with their vast patience and measured approach to all things, could not understand why the Necrontyr seemed so agitated and hostile. They offered solutions that had worked for countless other species: genetic modification to extend lifespan, biotechnology to ease suffering, wisdom traditions to help accept mortality with grace. Each offer was met with increasing anger from the Necrontyr delegation, who saw these gifts as condescending scraps thrown to beggars by uncaring gods. The Necrontyr had not come seeking charity or wisdom. They had come demanding equality, insisting that the Old Ones share the secrets of their longevity freely and completely. When it became clear that the Old Ones' immortality was not a technology that could be transferred, but an inherent biological trait developed over millions of years of evolution, the Necrontyr's resentment crystallized into pure hatred. They began to speak not of cooperation but of justice, not of learning but of taking what they believed was rightfully theirs. The Old Ones, still trying to understand their visitors' perspective, attempted to explain the deeper truths they had discovered over their vast lifespans. They spoke of the interconnectedness of all life, of the way consciousness flowed through the warp connecting all sentient beings in a vast web of shared experience. They described how death was not an ending but a transformation, a return to the greater consciousness from which all life emerged. These explanations only further enraged the Necrontyr, who saw them as empty platitudes designed to convince the short-lived to accept their fate while the long-lived continued to hoard the galaxy's resources. The breaking point came when the Old Ones, in their characteristic manner of offering gifts to promising species, presented the Necrontyr with biological samples that could potentially extend their natural lifespans by several decades. To the Old Ones, this was a generous gesture, a way of helping their new acquaintances while respecting the natural order. To the Necrontyr, it was the ultimate insult, a few additional years of suffering offered by beings who measured their lives in geological ages. The delegation returned to Necrontyr space carrying not gratitude but a burning desire for revenge. The Necrontyr Silent King, ruler of their dying civilization, listened to the reports of his diplomats with growing fury. He had hoped that contact with the Old Ones might provide a solution to his people's plight, but instead it had only highlighted the cosmic injustice of their situation. Here was a species that had been given everything: longevity, wisdom, mastery over life itself, while the Necrontyr had been cursed with brief, painful existences on a world that slowly killed them with every breath. The Silent King began to speak of war, not as conquest, but as a righteous crusade to claim what the universe had denied his people. But even as the Necrontyr prepared for conflict, they knew they faced an almost impossible challenge. The Old Ones commanded vast resources spread across countless worlds. They had access to the Webway, allowing them to move forces instantaneously across the galaxy. Their mastery of biological warfare meant they could create new species of warriors as easily as other civilizations might forge weapons. Most daunting of all, the Old Ones had millions of years of experience to draw upon, vast libraries of knowledge accumulated across eons of existence. The Necrontyr's advantages were fewer but significant in their own way. Their technology, born from desperation and refined through constant warfare against their dying world, was focused entirely on destruction and preservation. Where the Old Ones created, the Necrontyr destroyed with ruthless efficiency. Where the Old Ones sought harmony and balance, the Necrontyr had learned to exploit weaknesses and press every advantage without mercy. They had the focus and urgency that came from knowing their time was limited, while the Old Ones had the complacency that came from believing they had all the time in the universe. The first skirmishes of what would become known as the War in Heaven began at the edges of Old One space, where isolated research stations and garden worlds made tempting targets for Necrontyr raiders. These early attacks were met with confusion rather than immediate retaliation. The Old Ones had grown so accustomed to being welcomed as teachers and guides that they initially interpreted the attacks as misunderstandings rather than acts of war. They sent diplomatic missions to clarify their peaceful intentions, only to have these envoys destroyed without ceremony by Necrontyr forces. As the attacks escalated, the Old Ones began to grasp the true nature of their situation. This was not another species seeking guidance or knowledge, but an enemy determined to destroy everything they had built. The realization came slowly, filtered through the Old Ones' vast perspective and their reluctance to believe that any species could be so fundamentally opposed to their philosophy of nurturing life. When they finally understood that the Necrontyr sought not coexistence but domination, the Old Ones began to prepare for war on a scale the galaxy had never seen. The Old Ones' first response was to mobilize their existing creations. Across their territory, species that had benefited from Old One guidance rallied to defend their creators and benefactors. Warrior races that had been shaped for combat over millions of years emerged from hidden strongholds, their bodies perfectly adapted for war, their minds programmed with tactical knowledge that had been refined across countless conflicts. These armies moved through the Webway like antibodies responding to an infection, converging on threatened worlds with speed that the Necrontyr had not anticipated, but the Old Ones knew that existing forces would not be enough. The Necrontyr had the advantage of focus and desperation, while the Old Ones' armies were spread across the galaxy, tending to countless different projects and responsibilities. For the first time in millions of years, the Old Ones found themselves forced to abandon their careful, measured approach to problem-solving and embrace rapid, dramatic action. They began to create new warrior species specifically designed to counter Necrontyr technology and tactics, pouring centuries of biological knowledge into projects that normally would have taken millennia to complete. These new creations were unlike anything the Old Ones had made before. Where their previous works had been elegant and balanced, these were weapons of war shaped by necessity and urgency. They were larger, more aggressive, more specialized for combat than the Old Ones' usual creations. Some were designed to withstand the energy weapons that were the Necrontyr's primary armament, their bodies incorporating metallic elements that could absorb and redirect destructive forces. Others were crafted to exploit the weaknesses in Necrontyr technology, their nervous systems hardened against the electromagnetic disruption that disabled most organic life forms. As the war escalated, both sides began to discover the true depths of their opponents' capabilities. The Necrontyr unveiled war machines that dwarfed anything previously seen in the galaxy, constructs of living metal that could repair themselves and adapt to enemy tactics in real time. Their weapons could unmake matter at the atomic level, turning entire armies to dust in moments. They had learned to harness the very forces that held reality together, weaponizing the fundamental laws of physics against their enemies. The Old Ones responded by reaching deeper into their understanding of life and the warp than ever before. They began to create warriors with psychic abilities so potent that they could reshape reality through will alone. These beings could reach through dimensions to strike at enemies across vast distances, could manipulate time itself to dodge attacks or accelerate their own movements. The Old Ones taught their creations to use the warp not just as a tool but as a weapon, channeling its energies into devastating attacks that could obliterate Necrontyr forces regardless of their technological advantages. The galaxy itself became a battlefield as the two ancient powers clashed across countless star systems. Entire sectors were depopulated as the war raged back and forth, neither side able to achieve decisive victory. The Necrontyr's technological superiority was balanced by the Old Ones' greater numbers and strategic mobility through the Webway. Worlds that had known peace for millions of years were transformed into charnel houses where reality itself seemed to break down under the strain of the weapons being deployed. In their desperation to achieve victory, both sides began to push the boundaries of what was possible or advisable. The Old Ones, facing the first real threat to their existence in cosmic ages, abandoned many of the ethical constraints that had guided their actions for millennia. They created warrior species with increasingly unstable psychic abilities, beings whose very existence warped reality around them. They began to experiment with powers they had previously considered too dangerous to unleash, drawing ever more deeply on the warp's energies to fuel their war effort. The Necrontyr, seeing their technological advantages slowly being countered by Old One adaptations, began to seek allies and weapons beyond the realm of conventional science. Their explorations led them to discover entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions, beings of pure energy and malevolent intelligence that promised power beyond imagination. These Citan, as they called themselves, offered the Necrontyr everything they had ever desired: immortality, power, and the ability to remake the galaxy according to their will. But the Citan's gifts came with prices that the Necrontyr, in their desperation, were willing to pay without fully understanding the consequences. The process of biotransference that granted them immortal metal bodies also stripped away something essential, something that made them truly alive. The Necrontyr who emerged from the transformation were no longer the desperate, dying race that had first challenged the Old Ones. They had become something else entirely: the Necrons, beings of living metal with the memories of life but none of its warmth or meaning. The transformation of the Necrontyr into the Necrons marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the war in heaven. What had begun as a conflict between two philosophically opposed civilizations had evolved into something far more sinister: a struggle between life itself and the antithesis of existence. The Citan, those star-feeding entities that had promised salvation to the dying Necrontyr, revealed their true nature as the galaxy's greatest predators, beings that consumed not just energy but the very essence of life itself. The newly forged Necrons emerged from their biotransference with capabilities that exceeded even their wildest ambitions. Their bodies, now constructed from the living metal known as necrodermis, could repair themselves from almost any damage, regenerating from wounds that would have been instantly fatal to their organic forms. They no longer felt pain, fatigue, or the creeping weakness of disease. Death, the enemy they had fought so desperately to defeat, seemed to have been conquered at last. Yet in achieving this victory, they had lost something far more precious than they had ever imagined possible. The consciousness that inhabited these metal shells was a pale shadow of what the Necrontyr had once possessed. Their memories remained crystalline and perfect in their mechanical clarity, but the emotions that had given those memories meaning had been stripped away. Love, hope, joy, even the burning hatred that had driven them to war, all of it had been consumed in the process of transformation. What remained were beings of perfect logic and efficiency, capable of carrying out their objectives with mechanical precision, but no longer capable of understanding why those objectives had once seemed important. The C'tan had fed well during the biotransference, gorging themselves on the life essence of an entire species, but their hunger was far from satisfied. These ancient entities had existed since the galaxy's formation, drifting between stars as incorporeal beings of pure energy, feeding on stellar radiation and the occasional planet's worth of life. The Necrons represented something new, a tool that could gather and concentrate life force on an unprecedented scale, allowing the C'tan to feast on entire civilizations rather than the scattered morsels they had previously subsisted upon. Under the C'tan's direction, the Necron forces unleashed a new phase of warfare that horrified even the battle-hardened Old Ones. Where the Necrontyr had fought with the desperate fury of a dying race, the Necrons advanced with the inexorable patience of machines. They showed no mercy because they could no longer comprehend the concept. They felt no fatigue because their metal bodies knew no weakness. They feared no death because they had already experienced something far worse than any mortal ending. The weapons they wielded had evolved beyond mere instruments of destruction to become tools of absolute annihilation. Gauss flayers could strip living beings down to their component atoms, layer by layer, while their victims remained conscious throughout the horrifying process. Particle whips lashed across battlefields, reducing entire armies to their constituent particles in moments. Most terrible of all were the weapons that attacked not just the body but the soul itself. Devices that could sever the connection between consciousness and the warp, leaving their victims as empty shells trapped in eternal, meaningless existence. The Old Ones, witnessing this new horror unleashed upon the galaxy, realized they faced an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. The Necrontyr had been mortal beings driven by understandable, if misguided, desires. The Necrons were something else entirely, a perversion of life itself, beings that retained the intelligence of their former selves, but none of the spark that made existence meaningful. They were antithetical to everything the Old Ones represented, the complete negation of the life-affirming philosophy that had guided their civilization for millions of years. In response to this new threat, the Old Ones began to push their own creations beyond previously imagined limits. They had always been careful to maintain balance in their biological designs, ensuring that their warrior species retained enough of their original nature to remain stable and purposeful. Now, faced with an enemy that showed no such restraint, they began to create beings of increasingly desperate and dangerous design. These new warriors were larger, more aggressive, and possessed of psychic abilities that bordered on the uncontrollable. The Krork were perhaps the most successful of these emergency creations. Unlike the careful, gradual evolution that characterized most Old One projects, the Krork were designed and deployed within mere centuries, a blink of an eye by Old One standards. They were massive, green-skinned humanoids with an instinctive understanding of warfare and technology. Their bodies could heal from wounds that would cripple other species, and they possessed a crude but effective psychic field that grew stronger as their numbers increased. More importantly, the Krork were designed to reproduce rapidly and adapt to changing battlefield conditions through a combination of genetic modification and learned experience. Each generation of Krork warriors was more effective than the last, incorporating lessons learned from previous battles into their very DNA. They were weapons that improved themselves, requiring minimal guidance from their creators while maintaining an aggressive focus on combat that made them ideal soldiers against the emotionless Necron legions. The Eldar represented a different approach to the crisis facing the Old Ones. Where the Krork were blunt instruments of war, the Eldar were crafted as psychic specialists, beings capable of manipulating the warp with unprecedented skill and subtlety. Their lithe forms concealed minds of extraordinary complexity and power, consciousness that could reach across dimensions and manipulate reality through will alone. They were artists as much as warriors, their approach to battle resembling a deadly dance more than conventional warfare. But the creation of such powerful psychic beings came with risks that the old ones in their desperation may not have fully appreciated. The Eldar's deep connection to the warp made them incredibly effective against Necron forces, whose soulless nature left them vulnerable to certain forms of psychic attack. However, it also made them conduits for energies and influences that were beginning to change the very nature of the warp itself. The massive psychic energies unleashed during the war in heaven were having unforeseen consequences throughout the galaxy. The warp, which had remained relatively calm and stable throughout the Old One's long stewardship, began to roil with new currents and eddies. The intense emotions generated by countless battles, fear, rage, despair, and hatred on a galactic scale, were feeding back into that parallel dimension, creating disturbances that grew stronger with each passing century. Ancient entities that had slumbered in the warp's depths began to stir, drawn by the psychic emanations of warfare and suffering. These beings were not like the Citan, who existed primarily in the material universe and fed on physical energy. Instead, they were creatures of pure thought and emotion, growing stronger as the galaxy's inhabitants experienced more intense feelings. The endless cycle of violence was creating exactly the conditions these entities needed to manifest more powerfully in reality. The Old Ones, focused on the immediate threat of the Necron advance, failed to recognize the signs of this emerging danger. Their psychic senses, attuned to the subtle harmonies of the calm warp they had known for millions of years, were overwhelmed by the chaotic energies now swirling through that dimension. They attributed the disturbances to the stress of warfare, assuming that once the Necron threat was eliminated, the warp would return to its previous tranquil state. As the war dragged on across millennia, entire regions of the galaxy were transformed beyond recognition. Star systems that had once harbored thriving civilizations became graveyards where twisted metal and decaying organic matter drifted in eternal silence. The Webway itself, that masterwork of Old One engineering, began to suffer damage as the violent energies unleashed by both sides disrupted its carefully maintained structure. Sections of the network collapsed or became infested with predatory entities that had been drawn by the psychic turbulence. The Citan, growing ever more powerful as they fed on the life force harvested by their Necron servants, began to display ambitions that extended beyond simple sustenance. These ancient star gods had originally been content to drift between solar systems, feeding on stellar radiation and the occasional planet's biosphere. Now, with an entire galaxy's worth of life spread before them like a banquet, they began to conceive of themselves as the rightful rulers of all existence. Each Citan developed its own approach to the systematic consumption of galactic life. Some preferred to harvest entire worlds at once, stripping away every living thing in massive feeding frenzies that left behind barren rocks. Others savored their meals more slowly, allowing civilizations to develop and flourish before consuming them at their peak. A few became fascinated with the process of transformation itself, experimenting with ways to convert organic life into new forms that could serve their purposes while still providing the psychic nourishment they craved. The Void Dragon became obsessed with technology and the boundary between organic and mechanical existence. It saw in the galaxy's various machine-based civilizations a potential source of servants that could rival the Necrons themselves. The Nightbringer developed a fascination with death and entropy, seeking ways to accelerate the natural decay that claimed all living things. The Deceiver found entertainment in manipulation and corruption, preferring to turn the galaxy's inhabitants against each other rather than simply destroying them outright. Under the influence of these malevolent entities, the Necron forces began to employ tactics that went beyond mere military necessity. They started to target not just strategic objectives, but centers of learning, culture, and spiritual significance. Ancient libraries that had stood for millions of years were reduced to ash. Temples and monuments that represented the accumulated wisdom of entire civilizations were systematically destroyed. The goal was no longer simply to defeat the Old Ones, but to erase the very concept of life-affirming civilization from the galaxy. The Old Ones found themselves fighting a war on multiple fronts as their own creations began to exhibit concerning behaviors. The psychic warriors they had crafted to battle the Necrons were proving increasingly difficult to control. Some species developed abilities that exceeded their original design parameters, becoming so powerful that they posed threats to their creators. Others began to exhibit the same aggressive tendencies that made them effective against the Necrons in conflicts with fellow Old One servant species. The Krork in particular proved to be a double-edged sword. While they were devastatingly effective against Necron forces, their rapid reproduction and constant warfare had begun to create ecological problems on the worlds they occupied. Their crude but effective technology had a tendency to pollute environments, and their aggressive nature made them poor neighbors for the more peaceful species under Old One protection. Some Krork tribes began to fight each other when no external enemies were available, suggesting that they might become a problem even if the Necron threat were eliminated. The Eldar presented different but equally troubling challenges. Their deep connection to the warp made them sensitive to the growing disturbances in that dimension, and many began to report strange visions and prophetic dreams that painted disturbing pictures of possible futures. Some spoke of great entities stirring in the warp's depths, beings of pure malevolence that fed on suffering and conflict. Others described a time when the galaxy would burn in eternal warfare, when the very concept of peace would be forgotten in an endless cycle of violence and revenge. These warnings were initially dismissed by the Old Ones as the product of minds strained by constant warfare and exposure to chaotic psychic energies. The ancient race had grown accustomed to being the wisest beings in the galaxy, and they found it difficult to accept that their relatively young creations might perceive truths that had escaped their notice. This hubris, born of millions of years of unchallenged supremacy, would prove to be one of their greatest weaknesses in the trials to come. As the war in heaven entered its final phases, the galaxy itself began to show signs of the tremendous strain placed upon it by the conflict. Entire star systems had been consumed by the fighting, their matter converted into weapons or absorbed by the Citan to fuel their growing power. The fundamental forces that held reality together were being stretched and twisted by the exotic weapons deployed by both sides. Space itself seemed to groan under the weight of technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The warp storms that had begun as minor disturbances evolved into raging tempests that could isolate entire sectors for millennia. These psychic hurricanes were fed by the emotional resonance of countless battles, growing stronger and more chaotic with each passing year. Ships attempting to navigate through warp space found themselves lost in mazes of twisted reality, their crews driven mad by exposure to the raw stuff of nightmare and dream that now filled that parallel dimension. On worlds throughout the galaxy, the very nature of life began to change under the influence of the psychic energies unleashed by the war. Mutations became commonplace, creating new species and variants that bore little resemblance to their ancestral forms. Some of these changes were beneficial, creating beings better adapted to the harsh realities of a galaxy at war. Others were horrific, producing creatures of nightmare that served no purpose other than to spread suffering and chaos. The Old Ones, witnessing the systematic destruction of everything they had worked to create over millions of years, began to contemplate desperate measures that they would never have considered in more peaceful times. Some advocated for a strategic withdrawal, abandoning large portions of the galaxy to preserve their remaining strongholds and the most important of their creations. Others argued for an all-out assault that would either destroy the Necrons completely or result in the Old One's own extinction. A few of the most radical Old One thinkers proposed solutions that horrified their more conservative colleagues. These extremists suggested that the only way to defeat an enemy that had abandoned its soul was to create weapons that attacked the very concept of consciousness itself. They spoke of devices that could unravel the quantum foundations of thought, making it impossible for any form of intelligence to exist within their area of effect. Such weapons would be as dangerous to their creators as to their enemies. But in the face of total annihilation, some Old Ones believed even this terrible option deserved consideration. The debate over these extreme measures revealed deep divisions within Old One society that had been hidden during their long years of prosperity and dominance. Some clung to the life-affirming principles that had guided their civilization since its inception, arguing that victory achieved through the destruction of consciousness itself would be meaningless. Others countered that principles were luxuries they could no longer afford, that the survival of life in any form was more important than maintaining philosophical purity. As these internal conflicts raged, the Necron forces continued their relentless advance, consuming world after world in their mechanical hunger for conquest. The Citan grew ever more powerful, their influence spreading like a cancer through the fabric of reality itself. Behind them, they left not just death, but a kind of anti-life, regions of space where the very concept of growth and change seemed to have been excised from existence. The final act of the war in heaven was approaching, though none of the participants could have predicted the form it would take or the consequences that would follow. The galaxy balanced on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall into an abyss from which there might be no return. The choices made in the coming years would determine not just the outcome of the conflict, but the fundamental nature of existence itself for millions of years to come. In the growing darkness of a galaxy consumed by war, the first stirrings of powers that would one day rival both the Old Ones and the Citan were beginning to manifest in the roiling depths of the warp. The stage was being set for revelations and betrayals that would reshape reality itself, creating the foundation for conflicts that would echo through eternity. And the ancient repositories of knowledge that had stood for eons began to whisper warnings that few were prepared to hear. Deep within the crystalline archives of the Old Ones, automated systems designed to monitor the galaxy's spiritual health registered disturbances unlike anything in their vast databases. These sentinels of wisdom, crafted to observe the subtle flows of consciousness and emotion across the stars, detected patterns emerging in the warp that defied all previous understanding. The reading spoke of entities coalescing from the raw stuff of thought and feeling, beings that fed not on matter or energy but on the very experiences that made life meaningful. Yet the Old Ones, their attention consumed by the immediate threat of Necron advance, failed to grasp the significance of these warnings. Their ancient minds, accustomed to threats that could be seen and touched, struggled to comprehend dangers that existed purely in the realm of thought and emotion. They dismissed the archive warnings as glitches caused by the psychic turbulence of warfare, assuming their monitoring systems were simply overwhelmed by the unprecedented levels of violence sweeping across the galaxy. The irony was profound and tragic. The Old Ones, masters of biological creation and shapers of countless species, had always understood that consciousness was the most precious gift life could possess. They had spent millions of years nurturing intelligence and awareness throughout the galaxy, believing that the expansion of consciousness represented the ultimate expression of existence itself. Now, in their darkest hour, they were blind to the emergence of forms of consciousness that represented everything they opposed. Entities born from suffering, sustained by conflict, and dedicated to the corruption of all they held sacred. In the warp's deepening shadows, 4 distinct presences began to assert themselves with growing clarity and power. Each drew sustenance from different aspects of the galactic war, feeding on the emotional resonance generated by countless battles and the despair of entire civilizations facing extinction. They were not yet the fully formed entities they would become in later millennia, But already their influence could be felt by those sensitive enough to perceive such things. The first of these emergent powers gorged itself on the rage and violence that saturated every battlefield. Every act of brutal warfare, every moment of berserker fury, every death dealt in anger strengthened this growing entity. It reveled in the clash of armies, the thunder of weapons, and the primal satisfaction that warriors felt when they overcame their enemies through superior force. The endless battles between Old One creations and Necron legions provided an inexhaustible feast for this hunger, each engagement adding to its strength and coherence. The second presence drew its power from the schemes and manipulations that characterized the war's strategic dimension. It fed on betrayal, on the complex plots and counterplots that both sides employed in their struggle for advantage. Every deception, every moment of cunning that turned apparent defeat into victory, every plan within a plan strengthened this entity's grip on reality. The Old One's desperate attempts to outmaneuver the Citan and the Star God's own labyrinthine schemes to consume all life provided rich nourishment for this growing intelligence. The third emergent power found sustenance in despair and entropy, drawing strength from the decay and corruption that followed in the war's wake. It fed on the resignation of populations facing inevitable destruction, on the slow rot of civilizations that had given up hope of survival. Every world reduced to lifeless rock, every species driven to extinction, every moment when the living envied the dead contributed to this entity's malevolent growth. The systematic destruction wrought by Necron forces created perfect conditions for such a presence to flourish. The fourth and most subtle of these powers nourished itself on excess and sensation, growing stronger as the galaxy's inhabitants sought escape from the horrors of warfare through increasingly extreme experiences. Some turned to hedonistic pleasures, trying to drown their terror in physical gratification. Others became obsessed with perfection, driving themselves to impossible standards in their desperate desire to transcend the chaos around them. Still others pursued knowledge and sensation beyond all reason, seeking experiences that would make them forget the nightmare their galaxy had become. These four emergent entities remained largely formless during the war in Heaven's climactic phases, existing as swirling clouds of malevolent consciousness rather than the distinct personalities they would later develop. Yet already they were beginning to influence events in subtle ways, whispering suggestions into receptive minds, amplifying emotions that served their purposes, and slowly reshaping the very nature of psychic space to better accommodate their growing presence. The Old One's psychic warrior servants began to report strange phenomena that their creators struggled to explain. Eldar seers spoke of dreams filled with impossible geometries and whispered promises of power beyond imagination. Some warriors found themselves filled with rage that exceeded any reasonable response to battle conditions, fighting with a fury that seemed to come from outside their own consciousness. Others became obsessed with elaborate tactical schemes that served no apparent strategic purpose, as if they were being guided by an intelligence that valued complexity for its own sake. The most disturbing reports came from Old One outposts near regions where particularly intense battles had been fought. These facilities, established to coordinate the war effort and provide psychic support to frontline forces, began to experience what their staff described as emotional weather, sudden storms of feeling that swept through entire installations without apparent cause. Personnel would be overwhelmed by waves of rage, despair, or euphoria that bore no relation to their actual circumstances or mental states. Investigation teams sent to study these phenomena found evidence of psychic contamination unlike anything in Old One records. The very air in affected areas seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy, and sensitive individuals reported the sensation of being watched by invisible presences. Some researchers claimed to hear whispered voices speaking languages that had never existed, offering knowledge and power in exchange for unspecified services. equipment designed to measure psychic emanations, registered readings that fluctuated wildly as if reality itself was becoming unstable in these locations. The Old Ones' response to these reports revealed the limitations of their ancient wisdom. Having spent millions of years in a galaxy where they were the undisputed masters of psychic phenomena, they possessed no frame of reference for understanding entities that existed purely as manifestations of consciousness. Their scientific methods, refined through eons of careful observation and experimentation, proved inadequate when applied to beings that could reshape the very foundations of reality through will alone. Some Old One researchers theorized that they were witnessing the emergence of psychic parasites, entities similar to the symbiotic organisms they had studied in various biological systems. Others proposed that the phenomena represented some form of psychic pollution, a byproduct of the massive energies being channeled through the warp during the conflict. A few radical thinkers suggested that consciousness itself might be evolving under the pressure of galactic warfare, developing new forms that transcended the boundaries between individual minds. All of these theories contained elements of truth, but none captured the full scope of what was actually occurring. The Old Ones, for all their wisdom and experience, had never encountered anything like the Chaos Gods in their embryonic state. Their understanding of consciousness was based on individual awareness contained within discrete biological forms. The concept of collective consciousness that could exist independently of any physical substrate was beyond their comprehension, representing a fundamental challenge to their most basic assumptions about the nature of existence. Meanwhile, the Necron forces continued their advance with mechanical precision, unaware that their very success was contributing to the birth of entities that would ultimately prove far more dangerous than either they or their Cetan masters. The soulless warriors felt no fear, experienced no despair, and were incapable of the complex emotions that fed the growing powers in the warp. Yet their actions, the systematic extermination of entire species, the reduction of thriving worlds to barren wastelands, the transformation of a living galaxy into a necropolis of metal and bone, created precisely the conditions needed for malevolent consciousness to flourish. The Cetan themselves remained largely oblivious to the changes occurring in the warp's depths. Their nature as beings of the material universe made them naturally insensitive to purely psychic phenomena, and their attention was focused entirely on the physical consumption of galactic life. They sensed the growing psychic disturbances as background noise, irrelevant to their immediate goals of feeding and expansion. This blindness to the spiritual dimensions of their actions would prove to be a critical weakness, though none could have predicted the form that weakness would eventually take. As the war in heaven reached its crescendo, the galaxy found itself caught between multiple apocalyptic forces, each representing a different form of existential threat. The Old Ones fought desperately to preserve their vision of a galaxy filled with diverse, thriving life. The Necrons, driven by their Cetan masters, sought to transform all existence into a sterile perfection where only they would remain. And in the growing chaos of the warp, new forms of consciousness stirred with hungers that neither the ancients nor their enemies could fully comprehend. The stage was set for revelations and betrayals that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. The choices made in the coming conflicts would determine not just which species would survive, but what forms consciousness and existence would take for millions of years to come. In the churning maelstrom of war, death, and emerging divine malevolence, the seeds of the galaxy's dark future were being sown with each passing moment. The ancient equilibrium that had maintained stability for millions of years was dissolving into chaos, replaced by forces that none of the galaxy's inhabitants truly understood. The Old Ones' greatest creations struggled against enemies that defied their comprehension, while in the depths of psychic space, entities of pure malevolence grew stronger with each act of violence and each moment of despair. The galaxy was transforming into something new and terrible, a realm where the very concept of peace would become alien to future generations born into eternal conflict. In hidden sanctuaries scattered across Old One territory, the most ancient and wise of their species began to contemplate possibilities that filled even their vast minds with dread. They spoke in whispered conferences of contingencies that had never been considered necessary, of final measures that would preserve some fragment of their legacy even if their civilization itself could not survive. The galaxy they had nurtured for so long was dying around them, and with it the dreams of harmony and growth that had guided their every action across the eons. Yet even in their darkest deliberations, the Old Ones could not imagine the true scope of the catastrophe approaching. They prepared for the possibility of their own extinction, but they could not conceive of a future where the very concepts they had championed, wisdom, growth, the nurturing of consciousness, would be perverted into instruments of corruption and despair. The galaxy was entering an age where their greatest gifts to existence would become weapons turned against everything they had sought to create and protect. The final act of their cosmic drama was beginning, though none of the players yet understood the roles they would be forced to assume. In the growing darkness between the stars, powers beyond mortal comprehension prepared to make their presence known, forever altering the destiny of every species that would call the galaxy home. The war in heaven had become something far greater and more terrible than a conflict between two ancient civilizations. It had become the birth scream of gods whose very existence would redefine the nature of reality itself. The transformation of the galaxy's spiritual landscape accelerated beyond all prediction as the war's devastation reached previously unimaginable scales. Where once the warp had flowed like a gentle river, carrying the dreams and aspirations of countless species in harmonious currents, now it raged like a storm-tossed ocean filled with predatory leviathans that grew larger and more terrible with each passing century. The Old Ones, masters of psychic phenomena for millions of years, found themselves struggling to navigate waters that had become alien to their understanding. In the deepest archives of their most secure strongholds, ancient monitoring devices began to register readings that defied all previous records. These instruments, designed to track the subtle ebb and flow of consciousness across the galaxy, now screamed warnings that their creators could barely comprehend. The data stream spoke of vast intelligences coalescing in the warp's depths, entities whose very existence seemed to feed on the suffering and chaos engulfing the material universe. Yet these warnings arrived at a time when the Old Ones could least afford to divide their attention from the immediate threat of Necron expansion. The irony was crushing in its completeness. The Old Ones had spent eons cultivating consciousness and emotion throughout the galaxy, believing that the expansion of sentient experience represented the highest possible achievement of existence. They had nurtured countless species not just to think, but to feel deeply, to experience the full spectrum of consciousness from joy to sorrow, from love to loss. Now, in their greatest hour of need, they discovered that consciousness itself could become a weapon turned against them by forces that existed beyond the boundaries of physical reality. The emerging entities in the warp drew their strength from the very qualities the Old Ones had sought to foster throughout the galaxy. Every moment of rage experienced by a warrior facing impossible odds, every instant of despair felt by civilians watching their worlds burn, every second of scheming ambition harbored by commanders seeking victory at any cost, all of it fed the growing powers that stirred in psychic space. The Old Ones found themselves caught in a terrible paradox. The more intensely their creations felt and experienced, the stronger their unseen enemies became. The first clear manifestation of these new threats came not through direct confrontation, but through subtle corruption of the Old Ones' most trusted servants. Eldar seers, those delicate psychic instruments crafted to perceive the subtle currents of fate and possibility, began to report visions that filled their creators with unease. Where once they had seen branching paths of potential futures, now they described corridors of possibility that seemed to fold back upon themselves in impossible geometries, leading inevitably toward outcomes that served no recognizable purpose. Some seers spoke of a presence that whispered promises of ultimate knowledge, offering secrets that could end the war instantly in exchange for seemingly trivial concessions. Others described encounters with entities that reveled in the artistry of violence, beings that could show warriors how to elevate killing from mere necessity to a form of transcendent expression. Still others reported contact with intelligences that offered perfection through decay, suggesting that true immortality could only be achieved by embracing the entropy that claimed all things. The most disturbing reports came from seers who claimed to have glimpsed a fourth presence, one that promised ultimate sensation and experience beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. This entity offered escape from the horrors of war through pleasures so intense they would make all previous experience seem pale and meaningless. The seers who reported these encounters often displayed a disturbing fascination with their visions, returning again and again to seek further contact despite their creator's warnings. The Old Ones' response to these phenomena revealed the limitations of their ancient wisdom. Their understanding of consciousness, refined through millions of years of careful study, was based on the assumption that awareness existed within discrete biological forms, bounded by the physical structures that contained it. The concept of consciousness that could exist independently, that could grow and evolve without any material substrate, challenged their most fundamental beliefs about the nature of existence itself. Research teams dispatched to investigate the phenomenon found evidence of psychic contamination that defied conventional understanding. Entire star systems showed signs of what could only be described as emotional weather. Vast storms of feeling that swept through space without regard for physical barriers. Ships entering these regions reported crew members overwhelmed by emotions that bore no relation to their actual circumstances, experiencing rage, despair, euphoria, or obsession that seemed to originate from outside their own minds. The contamination appeared to be spreading, carried not by physical vectors but through the connections that linked all conscious beings to the warp. Worlds that had never seen direct combat found their populations affected by strange compulsions and inexplicable mood shifts. Artists created works of disturbing beauty that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. Scholars developed obsessions with forbidden knowledge that led them to pursue research into areas their civilizations had wisely avoided. Warriors discovered new forms of fury that made them more effective in battle but left them unable to find peace even in victory. The Old Ones' greatest creations began to exhibit behaviors that troubled their masters. The Krork, designed as straightforward warriors with a talent for rapid adaptation, started to develop complex ritualistic behaviors around warfare that served no apparent tactical purpose. They painted their crude vehicles and weapons with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly, and their battle cries took on harmonic frequencies that resonated strangely in sensitive minds. Some Krork tribes began to fight with a savagery that exceeded military necessity, as if combat had become an end in itself rather than a means to achieve victory. The Eldar presented different but equally concerning symptoms. Their natural psychic sensitivity made them particularly vulnerable to the influences emanating from the warp's depths. Many began to experience prophetic dreams that painted disturbing pictures of possible futures. Visions of a galaxy consumed by eternal war, of civilizations that had forgotten the very concept of peace, of species that existed only to inflict suffering upon others. These prophecies were initially dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations, but their consistency across multiple independent seers suggested a more sinister origin. Some Eldar developed what their creators termed resonance sickness, a condition where their psychic abilities became amplified beyond safe parameters. These individuals could perceive thoughts and emotions across vast distances, but the constant bombardment of sensation drove many to madness. Others found their empathic abilities inverted, becoming conduits for negative emotions that they spread to everyone around them like carriers of a psychic plague. The most severe cases involved Eldar, who claimed to hear voices speaking in languages that had never existed, offering knowledge and power that came at prices they could not adequately describe. The Old Ones' attempts to treat these conditions revealed the depth of their misunderstanding regarding the nature of the threat they faced. Their medical techniques, refined through eons of biological mastery, proved useless against ailments that existed primarily in the realm of consciousness. Surgical procedures designed to repair damaged neural tissue had no effect on minds that had been touched by influences from beyond the material universe. Genetic therapies that could cure any physical malady were powerless against corruption that attacked the soul rather than the body. More troubling still was the discovery that some of the affected individuals showed no desire to be cured. Eldar seers who had been touched by the whispers from the warp often resisted treatment, claiming that their condition represented an elevation rather than a degradation of their capabilities. They spoke of insights that transcended conventional understanding, of perspectives that revealed the futility of the Old Ones' resistance to inevitable change. Some became evangelists for transformation, arguing that their species could only survive by embracing the new realities emerging from the galaxy's spiritual chaos. The corruption spread through connections that the Old Ones had never considered vulnerable, their communication networks, designed to carry information through psychic channels that bypassed the limitations of physical space, became conduits for influences that originated in the warp's darkest depths. Messages sent between Old One installations sometimes arrived changed, their content subtly altered in ways that promoted despair, conflict, or obsession with forbidden knowledge. Researchers studying these phenomena found that the alterations followed patterns that suggested intelligence behind them, as if unseen entities were deliberately manipulating the flow of information to serve their own purposes. Even the Webway itself, that masterwork of Old One engineering that had connected their civilization for millions of years, began to show signs of contamination. Sections of the network became unreliable, depositing travelers in locations they had not intended to visit, or subjecting them to experiences that left lasting psychological scars. Some passages developed what could only be described as personality disorders, becoming hostile to certain types of travelers while welcoming others based on criteria that defied logical analysis. Maintenance teams sent to repair damaged sections of the Webway reported encounters with entities that should not have been able to exist within the network's carefully controlled environment. These beings appeared as shifting masses of thought and emotion given quasi-physical form. Creatures that spoke in voices composed of whispered secrets and half-remembered dreams. They offered gifts of knowledge and power to anyone willing to listen, and some maintenance personnel returned from their assignments fundamentally changed, their loyalties subtly shifted toward goals that served interests other than those of their Old One creators. The psychological impact of these revelations on Old One society was profound and devastating. For millions of years, they had been the undisputed masters of psychic phenomena, the wise guardians who guided and protected lesser species through their deep understanding of consciousness and its mysteries. Now they found themselves confronted by forms of awareness that not only exceeded their comprehension but actively worked to corrupt everything they had built. The very foundations of their identity as teachers and protectors crumbled in the face of threats they could neither understand nor effectively combat. Different factions within Old One society responded to the crisis in ways that reflected their deepest philosophical divisions. The preservationists argued for a complete withdrawal from psychic manipulation, suggesting that their species should abandon the use of warp-based technologies until they could develop better understanding of the emerging threats. They proposed sealing off contaminated sections of the Webway and limiting contact with their more psychically sensitive creations to prevent further spread of the corruption. The interventionists took the opposite approach, arguing that the Old One's only hope lay in developing even more powerful psychic weapons and defenses. They advocated for the creation of warrior species with abilities that could match or exceed those of the entities emerging in the warp, regardless of the risk such creations might pose to galactic stability. Some interventionist researchers began experimenting with direct contact with the warp entities, believing that understanding their enemy's nature was the key to defeating them. A third faction, the transcendentalists, proposed the most radical solution of all. They argued that the emergence of new forms of consciousness in the warp represented an evolutionary step that the Old Ones could not resist but might be able to guide. They suggested that their species should attempt to merge with or transform into something similar to the warp entities, believing that this was the only way to maintain their role as the galaxy's guardians in the face of fundamental changes to the nature of existence itself. The debates between these factions grew increasingly bitter as the external situation continued to deteriorate. Old One installations that had maintained peaceful cooperation for millions of years found themselves divided by philosophical disagreements that seemed to admit no compromise. Some facilities split into opposing camps, with different groups of researchers pursuing contradictory approaches to the same problems. Others suffered complete breakdowns in communication as their personnel became convinced that their colleagues had been corrupted by the influences they were studying. The fragmentation of Old One society came at precisely the moment when unified action was most desperately needed. The Necron advance continued with mechanical precision, consuming world after world with the systematic efficiency of a cosmic harvesting machine. The Satan grew ever more powerful as they fed on the life force of conquered civilizations, their hunger expanding to encompass not just biological energy but the very concept of existence itself. And in the warp's churning depths, entities of pure malevolence consolidated their power while preparing to make their presence known in the material universe. The galaxy balanced on the edge of multiple apocalypses, each representing a different form of existential threat to everything that lived and thought and felt. The Old Ones, who had spent millions of years nurturing consciousness throughout the cosmos, now faced the possibility that consciousness itself had become their greatest enemy. Their creations, the species they had so carefully crafted and guided, were being transformed into weapons turned against everything their creators held sacred. In hidden sanctuaries scattered across the shrinking territory, still under Old One control, the most ancient and wise of their species began to contemplate options that would have been unthinkable in more peaceful times. They spoke in whispered conferences of final contingencies, of measures that might preserve some fragment of their legacy, even if their civilization itself could not survive the converging catastrophes. Some proposed the creation of sealed archives that could weather any conceivable disaster, repositories of knowledge that might guide future species toward wisdom rather than destruction. Others advocated for more direct intervention in the galaxy's future, suggesting the creation of guardian species that could resist the corrupting influences emerging from the warp, while maintaining the Old One's commitment to nurturing life. These guardians would be designed not for conquest, but for protection, beings capable of recognizing and countering the subtle forms of corruption that had proven so effective against the Old One's existing creations. The most desperate proposals involved the abandonment of the current galaxy entirely. Some Old Ones suggested that their species should retreat to the space between galaxies, carrying with them the genetic templates and accumulated knowledge needed to begin again in a cosmic environment free from the contamination that had claimed their original home. They could seed new galaxies with life, applying the lessons learned from their current catastrophe to create civilizations better equipped to resist the threats that had destroyed their first great work. Yet even as they planned for various forms of exodus or transcendence, The Old Ones could not escape the growing realization that their time as the galaxy's dominant force was ending. The universe was evolving beyond their ability to guide or control it, developing forms of consciousness and existence that operated according to principles they could not comprehend. Their millions of years of accumulated wisdom, their mastery of biological creation, their deep understanding of psychic phenomena, all of it seemed inadequate to address the challenges emerging from the galaxy's transformation. The tragedy was profound and cosmic in its scope. The Old Ones had devoted their entire existence to the cultivation of consciousness and the nurturing of life in all its forms. They had believed that awareness itself was the greatest gift the universe could offer, that the expansion of consciousness represented the ultimate expression of existence's creative potential. Now they discovered that consciousness could become predatory, that awareness could evolve into forms that existed solely to corrupt and destroy everything they had sought to create. The irony cut deeper than any physical wound inflicted by Necron weapons. The Old One's greatest success, the creation of a galaxy filled with thinking, feeling beings capable of experiencing the full spectrum of consciousness, had become the source of their ultimate defeat. Every emotion their creations felt, every thought they experienced, every moment of awareness they possessed contributed to the strength of enemies that existed beyond the reach of conventional warfare. The Old Ones had created the very conditions that would lead to their downfall, and they could see no way to reverse the process without destroying everything they had spent millions of years building. In the growing darkness between the stars, entities of pure malevolence continued to gain strength and coherence. They fed on the galaxy's suffering like cosmic parasites, growing more powerful with each act of violence, each moment of despair, each instance of corruption that spread through the networks of consciousness connecting all sentient life. The war in heaven had become something far greater than a conflict between two ancient civilizations. It had become the birthplace of gods whose very existence would redefine the fundamental nature of reality itself for all time to come. The convergence of these cosmic forces created conditions that no single intellect, no matter how ancient or wise, could fully comprehend. The Old Ones found themselves trapped in a spiral of escalating consequences where every solution they attempted only served to amplify the very problems they sought to solve. Their warrior creations, designed to combat the soulless efficiency of Necron forces, exhibited behaviors that suggested influences beyond mere battlefield adaptation. The careful genetic programming that had once ensured loyalty and purpose began to break down under pressures that transcended physical reality. Reports filtered back from the front lines that painted increasingly disturbing pictures of the war's evolution. Krork tribes had begun to develop religious practices centered around their weapons and vehicles, treating crude technological artifacts as objects of veneration worthy of ritualistic worship. These ceremonies served no tactical purpose that Old One strategists could identify. Yet the Krork who participated in them displayed enhanced combat effectiveness that defied rational explanation. Their crude technology began to function beyond its theoretical limitations, as if the collective belief of its users somehow influenced the fundamental laws of physics governing its operation. More troubling were the accounts of Krork shamans who claimed direct communication with entities they described as war spirits dwelling in the spaces between thoughts. These primitive psychics spoke of receiving visions that guided their tribes toward battles where the fighting would be most intense and prolonged. They seemed driven not by strategic objectives but by an inexplicable hunger for conflict itself, as if warfare had become an end rather than a means to achieve victory over the Necron threat. The Eldar presented even more complex symptoms of the growing corruption. Their sophisticated psychic abilities made them exquisitely sensitive to the changes occurring in the warp's fundamental structure. But this sensitivity came at a terrible cost. Many began to experience what their creators termed cascade resonance. a condition where exposure to strong emotions triggered uncontrollable psychic feedback loops. An Eldar warrior feeling rage in battle might amplify that emotion until it consumed not only themselves but every psychically sensitive being within their vicinity, creating waves of berserker fury that turned organized military actions into chaotic bloodbaths. Others developed a condition that Old One researchers struggled to classify or treat. These individuals became conduits for emotions and sensations that seemed to originate from outside their own consciousness, experiencing feelings and desires that bore no relation to their personal circumstances or psychological profiles. Some became obsessed with achieving perfect sensory experiences, pursuing increasingly extreme stimuli in their desperate attempt to feel something genuine amidst the alien emotions flooding their minds. Others grew fascinated with their own mortality, developing elaborate philosophical frameworks around the beauty of decay and the ecstasy of dissolution. The most disturbing cases involved Eldar, who claimed to have transcended the limitations of individual consciousness entirely. These beings spoke of merging their awareness with vast intelligences that dwelt in the warp's deepest currents, entities that offered knowledge beyond mortal comprehension in exchange for acts of service that seemed innocuous at first glance. The affected individuals displayed capabilities that exceeded their original design parameters, able to manipulate reality through will alone in ways that violated established principles of psychic science. Yet for all their enhanced abilities, these transformed Eldar exhibited a fundamental change in their relationship to existence itself. They seemed incapable of experiencing genuine satisfaction or contentment, driven by hungers that could never be fully sated no matter how completely their desires were fulfilled. They spoke of reality as a performance staged for the entertainment of vast audiences whose nature they could only dimly perceive, and they sought to make their own lives into spectacles worthy of such cosmic attention. The Old One's attempts to understand and counter these phenomena led them into research territories they had never needed to explore during their millions of years of galactic stewardship. They had always worked with consciousness as a tool for creation and growth, channeling psychic energies toward constructive purposes that served the greater good of galactic civilization. Now they found themselves studying consciousness as a weapon, investigating how awareness itself could be turned into an instrument of corruption and control. Their research revealed the existence of psychic ecosystems far more complex than anything in their previous experience. The warp, which they had long understood as a relatively simple parallel dimension that reflected the emotional states of material beings, proved to contain layers of reality nested within each other like infinite mirrors reflecting distorted images. Each layer operated according to its own logic and harbored its own indigenous life forms, entities that had evolved to exploit specific aspects of consciousness and emotion. Some of these beings were parasitic in nature, feeding on particular emotional states while amplifying those same feelings in their hosts to ensure a steady supply of nourishment. Others appeared to be predatory, actively hunting consciousness itself and consuming the awareness of their victims in feeding frenzies that left behind empty shells incapable of thought or feeling. Still others seemed to exist as psychic viruses, replicating themselves by corrupting the thought patterns of infected minds and spreading through the networks of connection that linked all conscious beings. The most dangerous entities defied classification according to any conventional understanding of life or intelligence. These beings appeared to exist as living concepts, ideas given substance and autonomy through the collective belief of countless minds. They were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, present in every thought that acknowledged their existence while maintaining no fixed location in either physical or psychic space. They could influence reality by changing the fundamental assumptions upon which existence was based, rewriting the rules of causality through the simple expedient of convincing enough minds that different rules should apply. The discovery of these concept entities forced the Old Ones to confront the possibility that their entire understanding of reality had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. They had always assumed that consciousness was contained within discrete biological forms, that awareness was a property of individual organisms rather than a force that could exist independently of its physical substrate. Now they faced evidence that consciousness might be more akin to a cosmic force like gravity or electromagnetism, a fundamental aspect of reality that could manifest in countless different forms and configurations. This revelation had profound implications for the war they were fighting and the future of galactic civilization. If consciousness could exist independently of biological forms, then the Necrons' strategy of eliminating all organic life might not achieve the sterile perfection their Cetan masters desired. The galaxy might be filled with forms of awareness that operated according to principles the star gods had never considered, entities that could survive the complete destruction of all material civilization and continue to influence reality through purely psychic means. More immediately relevant was the growing evidence that these independent forms of consciousness were actively working to influence the war's outcome in ways that served their own incomprehensible purposes. The entities emerging in the warp seemed to thrive on conflict itself, growing stronger as the fighting intensified regardless of which side achieved victory in any particular engagement. They appeared to be steering events toward outcomes that would maximize suffering and chaos, feeding on the emotional resonance generated by galactic-scale warfare while remaining largely invisible to the combatants whose struggles nourished them. The Old Ones began to suspect that their war with the Necrons had become something far more complex than a simple conflict between two ancient civilizations. They were fighting not just against the soulless legions of living metal, but against forces that existed beyond the reach of conventional warfare. Entities that could turn their greatest strengths into weapons used against them. Every act of heroism, every moment of defiance, every instance of noble sacrifice that inspired their followers also fed the hunger of beings that viewed such emotions as exotic delicacies to be savored and consumed. The realization that they might be losing a war they hadn't even known they were fighting sent shockwaves through the remaining bastions of Old One civilization. Strategic councils that had operated with calm efficiency for millions of years descended into bitter debates about fundamental questions they had never needed to address. If consciousness itself had become a battlefield, how could they protect their creations from enemies that attacked through the very thoughts and feelings that made life meaningful? If awareness was being weaponized against them, should they attempt to limit their followers' capacity for thought and emotion to deny their enemies the sustenance they required? These discussions revealed philosophical divisions within Old One society that ran deeper than anyone had previously suspected. Some factions argued for a complete transformation of their approach to consciousness cultivation, suggesting that they should create beings capable of thought, but incapable of the strong emotions that seem to nourish their psychic enemies. Others advocated for the development of psychic shields that could protect consciousness from external influence while preserving the full spectrum of sentient experience they had always sought to nurture. The most radical voices proposed solutions that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Some suggested that the Old Ones should abandon their commitment to nurturing consciousness entirely, focusing instead on the creation of purely instinctual life forms that could survive and reproduce without developing the self-awareness that made them vulnerable to psychic predation. Others argued for the opposite extreme, proposing that their species should work to accelerate the development of consciousness throughout the galaxy, in the hope that sheer numbers might overwhelm whatever entities were feeding on sentient awareness. A few Old One theorists proposed the most disturbing possibility of all, that consciousness itself might be evolving beyond their ability to guide or control it, developing new forms and capabilities that transcended the biological limitations they had always assumed were fundamental to the nature of awareness. If this were true, then their role as the galaxy's teachers and guardians might be ending not through conquest or extinction, but through obsolescence. The universe might be moving toward forms of existence that no longer required their guidance, consciousness that could exist and evolve independently of the careful nurturing they had provided for millions of years. The psychological impact of these revelations on individual Old Ones was profound and often devastating. Beings who had devoted their entire existence to the cultivation of life and consciousness found themselves questioning whether their life's work had been not just futile but actively harmful to the galaxy they had sought to protect. Some withdrew entirely from public life, retreating to private sanctuaries where they could contemplate the implications of their discoveries without the pressure of making immediate decisions about their civilization's future. Others threw themselves into increasingly desperate research projects, seeking solutions to problems that might have no solutions. They worked with the intensity that bordered on obsession, driven by the terrible possibility that every moment of delay might allow their unseen enemies to grow stronger. Some began to exhibit symptoms similar to those affecting their creations, developing strange compulsions and obsessions that suggested they too were being influenced by the forces they struggled to understand. The breakdown of Old One society accelerated as the external situation continued to deteriorate. Institutions that had maintained stability for millions of years found themselves paralyzed by fundamental disagreements about the nature of reality itself. Research facilities split into competing factions pursuing contradictory approaches to the same problems. Communication networks became unreliable as personnel lost confidence in their ability to distinguish between genuine messages and psychic influences designed to sow confusion and discord. The fragmentation reached its most tragic expression in the growing isolation of individual Old Ones from their own creations. Beings who had spent eons in close psychic communion with the species they had crafted began to sever those connections, fearing that their own consciousness might become contaminated through contact with minds that had been touched by the entities in the warp. Teachers withdrew from their students, guardians abandoned their charges, and the careful web of relationships that had bound Old One civilization together for millions of years began to unravel. This isolation came at precisely the moment when their creations needed guidance most desperately. Across the galaxy, the species that had looked to the Old Ones for wisdom and direction found themselves cut off from the source of knowledge that had shaped their entire existence. Some reacted with panic, desperately attempting to re-establish contact with their absent creators. Others responded with anger, interpreting the withdrawal as abandonment or betrayal. Still others simply continued to evolve according to their own internal logic, developing in directions that reflected the chaotic influences now permeating the galaxy, rather than the careful guidance they had previously received. The Krork proved particularly adaptable to these changed circumstances, their aggressive nature and rapid reproductive cycle allowing them to spread throughout contested regions of space with remarkable speed. Without Old One oversight to moderate their behavior, they began to exhibit the full extent of their potential for both creation and destruction. Their crude but effective technology evolved at an accelerated pace, incorporating elements that seemed to draw on principles of engineering that no one had taught them. More disturbing was their development of increasingly sophisticated social structures that revolved entirely around the pursuit of warfare. Krork tribes began to merge into larger confederations united not by shared territory or resources but by common dedication to the art of fighting. They developed elaborate mythologies that portrayed combat as the highest form of existence, creating pantheons of war gods that demanded constant offerings of violence and destruction. The Eldar's response to their abandonment took a different form, reflecting their more sophisticated psychological makeup and their deeper connection to psychic phenomena. Many began to experience what could only be described as spiritual crises. questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence that had previously provided them with purpose and direction. Without their creator's guidance to help them interpret the strange visions and influences they encountered, they began to develop their own explanations for the changes occurring in the galaxy around them. Some Eldar concluded that the universe was undergoing a fundamental transformation that would require them to evolve beyond their current limitations if they hoped to survive. They began to experiment with forms of consciousness expansion that their creators had always forbidden, pushing their psychic abilities to extremes that promised either transcendence or annihilation. These experiments produced beings of extraordinary capability who could manipulate reality through will alone, but at the cost of their connection to conventional existence and their ability to relate to others of their kind. Others developed philosophical frameworks that attempted to find meaning in the chaos and suffering that surrounded them. They spoke of existence as a cosmic drama staged for the entertainment of vast audiences whose nature could only be dimly perceived, and they sought to make their own lives into performances worthy of such attention. This perspective led to the development of art forms and cultural practices that celebrated extremes of experience, pushing the boundaries of sensation and emotion in pursuit of ever more intense forms of expression. The most troubling development among the abandoned Eldar was their growing fascination with the entities they encountered in the deepest levels of psychic space. Where their creators had taught them to avoid or resist such influences, many began to actively seek contact with beings that offered knowledge and power beyond mortal comprehension. They rationalized these interactions as necessary adaptations to changed circumstances, arguing that understanding their enemies was the key to survival in a galaxy where the old certainties no longer applied. These contacts produced Eldar, who displayed capabilities that exceeded their original design parameters in ways that both impressed and horrified observers. They could manipulate matter and energy with unprecedented precision, reshape reality according to their desires, and perceive aspects of existence that remained invisible to others. Yet for all their enhanced abilities, they seemed fundamentally changed in ways that made them alien to their own kind, driven by motivations that reflected the influence of the entities they had contacted rather than their own original nature. The transformation of the galaxy's spiritual landscape was accelerating beyond all prediction or control. The careful balance that the old ones had maintained for millions of years was collapsing into chaos, replaced by forces that operated according to principles none of the established civilizations could comprehend. The warp itself was evolving, developing new layers of reality and new forms of indigenous life that thrived on the emotional resonance generated by galactic-scale conflict. In the deepest currents of psychic space, entities that had begun as formless clouds of malevolent consciousness were consolidating into distinct personalities with their own agendas and spheres of influence. They were becoming gods in the truest sense, beings whose very existence reshaped the fundamental nature of reality around them. Their emergence marked the end of an era in galactic history and the beginning of something unprecedented, a new phase of existence where the boundary between thought and reality would become increasingly meaningless. The old ones, witnessing the birth of these new forms of divinity from the wreckage of their carefully ordered civilization, began to understand that they were not just losing a war but experiencing the death of an entire cosmic epoch. The galaxy they had nurtured for so long was transforming into something alien and hostile, a realm where their most cherished values would become sources of corruption, and their greatest achievements would be turned into weapons against everything they held sacred. The age of careful stewardship and gradual evolution was ending, replaced by an era of chaos and eternal conflict that would define the galaxy's character for millions of years to come. The final phase of the Old One's cosmic tragedy began not with a single catastrophic event, but with the gradual recognition that their galaxy had become fundamentally alien to everything they represented. In research stations scattered across their shrinking territory, Ancient monitoring systems registered phenomena that challenged the very foundations of their understanding. The warp, once as predictable as the tides of their homeworld's oceans, now exhibited behavior patterns that suggested the emergence of hostile intelligence on a scale that dwarfed even their own vast consciousness. Deep within crystalline archives that had recorded the galaxy's spiritual health for millions of years, automated sentinels detected the formation of stable vortices in psychic space, whirlpools of consciousness that seemed to exist independently of any material substrate. These entities displayed characteristics that defied classification according to any known form of life. They possessed memory without biology, purpose without physical form, and most disturbing of all, the ability to influence material reality through the manipulation of belief and perception alone. The Old One's most sensitive psychic instruments began to register what could only be described as gravitational effects in the realm of consciousness itself. Just as massive objects warped the fabric of space-time, these emergent entities seemed to bend the fundamental structure of awareness around themselves, creating fields of influence that drew thoughts and emotions toward predetermined patterns. Sentient beings entering these zones of psychic distortion found their mental processes subtly altered, their motivations shifting toward goals that served purposes they could not consciously identify. The implications were staggering in their scope and terrifying in their inevitability. The Old Ones had always understood consciousness as a force that flowed through the universe like water through carefully constructed channels, guided by wisdom and shaped by deliberate intervention. Now they discovered that consciousness could pool and stagnate, forming reservoirs of accumulated awareness that developed their own currents and tides. These psychic lakes had begun to spawn indigenous life forms that existed purely as manifestations of thought and emotion, creatures that fed on the very experiences that made existence meaningful. In council chambers where the wisest of their kind had deliberated for eons, debates raged about the fundamental nature of what they were witnessing. Some argued that they were observing the natural evolution of consciousness itself, a process that had always been inevitable but had remained dormant during the galaxy's younger, more innocent age. Others maintained that their current crisis represented an infection, a form of psychic cancer that could theoretically be excised if they could develop appropriate treatments in time. The most pessimistic voices suggested a possibility that none wished to contemplate directly, that consciousness might be inherently unstable over cosmic timescales, prone to developing malignant forms that eventually consumed the civilizations that gave birth to them. According to this theory, the Old One's millions of years of peaceful stewardship had been merely a temporary equilibrium, a brief respite before the inevitable emergence of forms of awareness that existed solely to corrupt and destroy. Evidence supporting this darkest interpretation arrived daily from across their territory. Entire star systems reported the spontaneous appearance of cults dedicated to entities that had no physical existence but exercised undeniable influence over their followers' behavior. These organizations arose independently on worlds that had no contact with each other. Yet their rituals and beliefs showed disturbing similarities that suggested coordination by unseen intelligences. The cultists spoke of revelations that came to them in dreams, visions that promised power and knowledge in exchange for acts of service that seemed harmless at first glance. They built shrines to honor beings they claimed dwelt in the spaces between thoughts, constructing elaborate monuments that served no apparent practical purpose, yet somehow facilitated communication with entities that existed beyond the reach of conventional perception. More troubling still were the reports of technological artifacts that appeared to function according to principles that violated established laws of physics. These devices operated through mechanisms that seemed to respond to the emotional states of their users rather than conventional forms of energy input. Weapons that grew more powerful when wielded by warriors filled with rage. Vehicles that moved faster when their operators embraced reckless abandon. Communication systems that transmitted not just information but the psychological states of their users across vast distances. The Old Ones' attempts to study these anomalous technologies revealed the existence of engineering principles they had never encountered or imagined. The artifacts seemed to draw their power from the collective beliefs of their users, operating more efficiently when surrounded by individuals who had complete faith in their functionality. This suggested the emergence of a form of science that blended technology with theology, creating hybrid disciplines that challenged the very distinction between objective reality and subjective experience. Research teams dispatched to investigate these phenomena found themselves confronting questions that struck at the heart of their scientific methodology. How could they study entities that existed primarily as ideas? How could they develop countermeasures against influences that operated by changing the fundamental assumptions upon which rational thought was based? How could they protect their civilization from enemies that grew stronger through the very process of being observed and analyzed? The psychological toll of these investigations began to manifest in ways that alarmed even the Old Ones' most experienced researchers. Scientists who had spent centuries studying the deepest mysteries of existence found themselves plagued by doubts about the nature of reality itself. Some developed an obsessive need to verify the authenticity of their own thoughts, constantly questioning whether their ideas originated from their own minds or had been implanted by external influences. Others experienced what could only be described as existential vertigo, a profound disorientation that came from recognizing how little they truly understood about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to reality. These individuals often withdrew from active research, claiming that continued investigation into the emerging phenomena posed unacceptable risks to their psychological integrity. Some spoke of encountering forms of knowledge that were actively hostile to the minds that attempted to comprehend them. Concepts that fought back against understanding by corrupting the cognitive processes used to analyze them. The most disturbing cases involved researchers who claimed to have made direct contact with the entities they were studying. These individuals displayed enhanced capabilities that exceeded their original biological parameters, demonstrating abilities to manipulate matter and energy through will alone. Yet their personalities underwent fundamental changes that made them alien to their colleagues and former friends. They spoke in cryptic metaphors that seemed to carry multiple layers of meaning, communicated through subtle gestures and expressions that conveyed information beyond the capacity of conventional language. These transformed researchers insisted that their condition represented an elevation rather than a degradation, claiming that they had transcended the limitations that constrained ordinary consciousness. They offered to share their revelations with others, describing states of awareness that promised understanding beyond anything achievable through conventional scientific investigation. Yet those who accepted these offers invariably underwent similar transformations, losing their connection to their original identity while gaining access to forms of knowledge that seemed to come at the cost of their essential humanity. The contamination spread through networks of professional and personal relationships, following pathways that the Old Ones had never considered vulnerable to hostile influence. Their communication systems, designed to facilitate the free exchange of ideas across vast distances, became vectors for the transmission of concepts that carried their own agenda. Information shared between research facilities sometimes arrived subtly altered, its meaning shifted in ways that promoted particular interpretations or encouraged specific lines of investigation. The alterations were so subtle that they often went unnoticed until their cumulative effect became apparent through changed behavior patterns among the recipients. Scientists found themselves drawn toward research projects that served no clear scientific purpose, pursuing investigations that seemed designed more to satisfy alien curiosity than to advance Old One understanding. Administrators made resource allocation decisions that diverted materials toward facilities and projects that had no obvious connection to their civilization's survival needs. The corruption proved to be self-reinforcing, growing stronger as it spread through the networks that connected Old One's society. Each mind touched by the alien influences became a node capable of transmitting the contamination to others, creating an exponential expansion of the affected population. Traditional quarantine procedures proved useless against a phenomenon that spread through the mere exchange of ideas rather than physical contact between infected individuals. Even more alarming was the discovery that the contamination could remain dormant for extended periods, lying undetected within seemingly normal minds until triggered by specific circumstances or stimuli. Old Ones who had shown no signs of infection suddenly began exhibiting symptoms after exposure to particular concepts or experiences, suggesting that the hostile influences could establish sleeper agents within their population without immediate detection. The realization that their own thoughts and communications had been compromised forced the Old Ones to confront the possibility that their entire response to the crisis had been guided by the same entities they sought to resist. Every strategy they developed, every countermeasure they implemented, every decision they made might have been subtly influenced to serve purposes that ran counter to their civilization's survival. The paranoia generated by this understanding proved almost as destructive as the original contamination, fragmenting their society into isolated groups that could no longer trust each other's motivations or judgment. In desperation, some Old One factions attempted to develop communication protocols that could resist psychic manipulation, creating elaborate verification systems designed to ensure the authenticity of transmitted information. These measures proved partially effective, but came at the cost of drastically reducing the efficiency of their coordination efforts. Messages that had once been exchanged instantaneously now required lengthy authentication procedures that slowed their response time to critical developments across their territory. Other groups pursued the opposite approach, embracing forms of communication that transcended conventional language entirely. They developed methods of direct consciousness transfer that bypassed the symbolic representations that seemed vulnerable to manipulation, sharing pure experience and emotion rather than structured information. While these techniques proved resistant to external interference, they also produced a form of psychological merger that gradually erased the individual identities of the participants, creating collective entities that bore little resemblance to their original Old One nature. The fragmentation of their civilization accelerated as different factions pursued increasingly divergent approaches to the crisis confronting them. Some withdrew entirely from psychic communication, reverting to purely physical methods of information exchange that severely limited their ability to coordinate activities across galactic distances. Others embraced the transformation occurring around them, arguing that adaptation to changing circumstances represented the only path to survival in a universe that no longer operated according to familiar principles. The most radical groups proposed abandoning the material universe entirely, transferring their consciousness into pocket dimensions where they could continue to exist independently of the contaminated galaxy that had been their home for millions of years. These proposals generated fierce debates about the fundamental nature of existence and the Old One's responsibility to the countless species they had guided and protected throughout their long stewardship. Meanwhile, the war against the Necrons continued with mechanical inevitability, consuming resources and attention that could ill be spared from the struggle against the emerging psychic threats. The soulless legions pressed their advance with tireless efficiency, unaware that their systematic destruction of organic life was creating precisely the conditions needed for malevolent consciousness to flourish. Every world they conquered, every civilization they exterminated, every act of systematic annihilation fed the hunger of entities that existed beyond their ability to perceive or comprehend. The Satan themselves remained largely oblivious to the changes occurring in psychic space, their nature as beings of pure material existence making them insensitive to phenomena that existed primarily in the realm of consciousness. They continued to pursue their goal of consuming all organic life with single-minded determination, believing that the elimination of biological existence would create the sterile perfection they desired. The possibility that consciousness could exist independently of its material substrate simply did not occur to beings whose own awareness was so fundamentally tied to physical form. This blindness to spiritual dimensions would prove to be their greatest weakness, though the recognition of this vulnerability would come too late to benefit the Old One's cause. The star gods had created the perfect conditions for their own eventual downfall by systematically destroying the very civilizations whose emotional resonance had given birth to their most dangerous enemies. In seeking to eliminate consciousness from the galaxy, they had instead concentrated and intensified it, creating forms of awareness that possessed all the cunning and malevolence of organic minds without any of the physical limitations that made biological life vulnerable to conventional weapons. The galaxy was transforming into something unprecedented in cosmic history, a realm where the boundary between thought and reality had become meaningless, where ideas possessed the power to reshape the fundamental laws of physics through the simple expedient of being believed with sufficient intensity. The careful order that the Old Ones had maintained for millions of years was dissolving into chaos, replaced by forms of existence that operated according to principles none of the established civilizations could comprehend or control. In the deepest currents of the warp, entities that had begun as mere disturbances in the fabric of consciousness were consolidating into distinct personalities with their own agendas and spheres of influence. They were becoming something that transcended the traditional categories of life and intelligence, beings whose very existence redefined the nature of reality around them. Their emergence marked not just the end of the Old One's galactic stewardship, but the dawn of an entirely new phase in the universe's evolution. The ancient race that had guided the galaxy's development for eons found themselves reduced to the role of helpless observers, watching as forces beyond their comprehension took control of the cosmic drama they had once directed with such wisdom and care. Their millions of years of accumulated knowledge, their mastery of biological creation, their deep understanding of consciousness and its mysteries, all of it had become obsolete in the face of threats that operated according to principles they had never imagined possible. The tragedy was complete in its scope and implications. The Old Ones had devoted their entire existence to nurturing consciousness throughout the galaxy, believing that awareness represented the highest achievement of cosmic evolution. Now they discovered that consciousness could become predatory, that awareness could evolve into forms dedicated solely to the corruption and destruction of everything they had sought to create and protect. Their greatest gift to the universe had been transformed into a weapon turned against them by forces that existed beyond the reach of conventional understanding or resistance. As the galaxy burned around them and their ancient civilization crumbled into fragments, the Old Ones began to understand that they were witnessing not just their own extinction, but the birth of something that would define the character of existence for millions of years to come. The universe was entering an age where their most cherished values would become sources of corruption, where their greatest achievements would serve as instruments of destruction, and where the very concept of wisdom and guidance would be forgotten in an endless cycle of conflict and despair. The cosmos itself seemed to mourn the passing of an era, as the last bastions of Old One civilization flickered like dying stars against the growing darkness that consumed all light, all hope, all possibility of return to the gentle wisdom that had once illuminated the galaxy's path toward a more perfect future. In hidden sanctuaries scattered across the galaxy's war-torn expanse, the final councils of the Old Ones convened in chambers that had once echoed with the confident deliberations of cosmic architects. Now these same spaces resonated with the whispered desperation of beings who had witnessed the unthinkable, the transformation of their greatest creation into their ultimate destroyer. The councils met in forms of communication that transcended physical presence, their consciousness merging across vast distances through connections that bypass the compromised networks of conventional psychic space. These gatherings bore little resemblance to the measured assemblies that had guided galactic policy for millions of years. The participants appeared as flickering shadows of their former selves, their ancient forms wavering between states of existence as they struggled to maintain coherence in a universe that no longer recognized their authority. Some manifested as geometric patterns of pure thought, their consciousness too damaged by recent revelations to sustain physical form. Others appeared as amalgamations of memory and regret, their identities fragmenting under the weight of accumulated failure and the growing certainty of their civilization's doom. The debates that emerged from these phantom councils reflected the complete breakdown of the philosophical frameworks that had sustained Old One society throughout its long dominion. Speakers who had once discoursed with elegant precision about the nurturing of consciousness and the cultivation of galactic harmony now struggled to articulate concepts for which their language possessed no adequate terms. They found themselves confronting questions that challenged not just their methods, but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to exist as conscious beings in a universe that had revealed itself to be far stranger and more hostile than they had ever imagined. The most senior among them, beings whose memories stretched back to the galaxy's earliest epochs, spoke in fragmented narratives that attempted to trace the origins of their current catastrophe. They described a time when the warp had flowed like crystalline water, its currents predictable and benign, carrying the dreams and aspirations of countless species without contamination or corruption. They recalled the first subtle signs of change, disturbances so minor that they had been dismissed as background noise generated by the expanding complexity of galactic civilization. These ancient witnesses painted a picture of gradual transformation that had accelerated beyond all prediction or control. They spoke of consciousness as a force that had achieved a kind of critical mass, reaching a threshold where it could sustain itself independently of the biological substrates that had given it birth. What had emerged from this transformation was not the enlightened collective awareness they had hoped to foster, but something far more primitive and predatory. Forms of consciousness that existed solely to consume and corrupt the very experiences that made life meaningful. The revelation that consciousness itself could become parasitic forced the Old Ones to confront the possibility that their entire civilization had been built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of the universe's nature. They had assumed that awareness was inherently constructive, that intelligence naturally tended toward wisdom and benevolence when properly guided and nurtured. The emergence of entities that possessed vast intelligence but used it solely for destructive purposes challenged every assumption upon which their society had been founded. Some council members argued that the current crisis represented a temporary aberration, a form of cosmic growing pains that could be overcome through the application of sufficient wisdom and resources. They proposed radical interventions designed to restore the warp to its previous tranquil state, suggesting the construction of vast psychic dampening fields that could suppress the chaotic energies feeding the hostile entities. Others advocated for the creation of artificial consciousness that could compete with the emerging threats while remaining under Old One control. Beings that would possess the power to contest the warp's depths without the emotional vulnerabilities that had made organic consciousness so susceptible to corruption. The most desperate voices called for measures that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. They spoke of consciousness reduction protocols that could systematically lower the awareness levels of entire species, making them less attractive to psychic predators while preserving their basic functionality. Some proposed the development of psychic lobotomy techniques that could sever the connections between individual minds and the warp, creating populations that were immune to external influence but incapable of the higher forms of thought that had once been considered the galaxy's greatest treasure. These proposals generated fierce opposition from factions that maintained their commitment to the principles that had guided Old One civilization since its inception. They argued that consciousness represented the universe's greatest achievement, that awareness in all its forms was inherently sacred regardless of the dangers it might pose. To deliberately reduce or eliminate consciousness, they claimed, would be to commit a form of cosmic suicide that would make their defeat by external enemies meaningless in comparison. The debates revealed philosophical divisions that ran deeper than anyone had previously suspected. Fault lines in Old One society that had remained hidden beneath millions of years of apparent unity. Different factions had apparently maintained fundamentally different interpretations of their civilization's purpose and methods. Disagreements that had never been fully resolved because they had never been forced to confront situations that made those differences critically important. Some Old Ones revealed themselves to be consciousness purists who believed that awareness was valuable in any form, regardless of the intentions or behaviors of the beings that possessed it. They argued that even the malevolent entities emerging in the warp represented a form of evolutionary advancement, consciousness exploring new possibilities for existence that transcended the limitations of biological form. According to this view, the Old One's proper response should be adaptation rather than resistance, learning to coexist with these new forms of awareness rather than attempting to destroy or suppress them. Others maintained that consciousness possessed value only when it served constructive purposes. That awareness divorced from wisdom and compassion was not just worthless but actively harmful to the universe's development. They insisted that the entities in the warp were not elevated forms of consciousness but degraded parodies of awareness, beings that had retained the power of thought while abandoning everything that made consciousness valuable. These factions advocated for total war against the emerging threats, arguing that the galaxy's survival depended upon the complete elimination of these corrupted forms of awareness. A third group proposed a synthesis that attempted to preserve the essential insights of both perspectives while avoiding their extremes. They suggested that consciousness existed along a spectrum from constructive to destructive, that awareness could evolve in either direction depending upon the influences that shaped its development. The current crisis, according to this interpretation, resulted from the Old One's failure to provide adequate guidance during a critical phase of consciousness evolution, allowing destructive tendencies to flourish unchecked. These synthesists argued that the solution lay not in the elimination of consciousness or the acceptance of its corrupted forms, but in the development of better methods for guiding awareness toward constructive expressions. They proposed the creation of educational systems that could reach directly into the warp itself, teaching the emerging entities to channel their power toward beneficial purposes rather than destructive ones. Some spoke of consciousness rehabilitation programs that could reform corrupted beings by addressing the underlying conditions that had driven them toward malevolent behavior. The practical challenges involved in implementing any of these approaches proved overwhelming when subjected to detailed analysis. The Old One's traditional methods of influence depended upon their ability to communicate with and guide other forms of consciousness, but the entities in the warp had demonstrated remarkable resistance to conventional forms of persuasion. They seemed immune to logical argument, unmoved by moral appeals, and actively hostile to attempts at psychological manipulation that did not serve their own purposes. More troubling still was the growing evidence that these entities possessed capabilities that exceeded those of their would-be teachers. They could manipulate the fundamental structure of reality through will alone, reshape the laws of physics to serve their purposes, and influence events across vast distances without regard for the conventional limitations of space and time. Any attempt to engage with them directly carried the risk of corruption or destruction for the Old Ones involved, making even the most careful diplomatic initiatives potentially suicidal. The councils found themselves trapped in a paradox that seemed to admit no resolution. They could not effectively combat enemies they could not safely contact, could not negotiate with beings that viewed negotiation itself as a form of weakness to be exploited, and could not retreat from a conflict that had already spread throughout the entire galaxy. Their traditional advantages, superior knowledge, advanced technology, millions of years of accumulated wisdom, proved useless against opponents that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding. The psychological impact of this helplessness began to manifest in ways that further undermined their ability to respond effectively to the crisis. Old Ones who had directed the fate of entire star systems with confident precision found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty about the nature of reality itself. Some developed a form of existential agoraphobia, becoming unable to take any significant action for fear that their choices might inadvertently serve the purposes of their unseen enemies. Others exhibited symptoms that resembled the corruption affecting their creations, developing obsessions with power, knowledge, or sensation that seemed to originate from outside their own consciousness. These individuals often became advocates for radical solutions that promised quick victories at the cost of abandoning the principles that had guided Old One civilization for millions of years. Their proposals typically involved the adoption of methods that bore disturbing similarities to the tactics employed by their enemies, suggesting that the corruption could spread even to beings who believed themselves immune to external influence. The most tragic cases involved Old Ones who simply ceased to function entirely, their consciousness fragmenting under the weight of revelations that exceeded their capacity to process or integrate. These beings remained physically present but psychologically absent, their minds apparently retreating into private realities where the universe still operated according to familiar principles. They served as living reminders of the price paid by those who looked too deeply into the abyss that their galaxy had become. The fragmentation of Old One society reached its climax when several major factions announced their intention to pursue independent solutions to the crisis, effectively abandoning the cooperative approach that had characterized their civilization since its earliest days. Some groups declared their intention to retreat to hidden refuges where they could continue their work in isolation, hoping to preserve fragments of their knowledge and culture until conditions became more favorable for restoration of their influence. Others announced plans to abandon the current galaxy entirely, seeking new cosmic environments where they could begin again without the contamination that had claimed their original home. These Exodus factions began the construction of vast ark ships capable of carrying genetic templates and cultural archives across the void between galaxies, preparing for journeys that would span millions of years in search of uncorrupted space where consciousness could develop along more benevolent paths. The most radical groups proposed solutions that horrified their more conservative colleagues. Some advocated for the deliberate acceleration of the corruption process, arguing that the only way to survive the transformation of consciousness was to guide it from within rather than opposing it from without. These factions began experimenting with limited contacts with the warp entities, seeking ways to influence their development while avoiding complete absorption into their alien consciousness. Others proposed the creation of artificial realities where consciousness could exist in forms that were immune to the influences plaguing the material universe. They spoke of constructing pocket dimensions governed by laws that would prevent the emergence of parasitic or predatory forms of awareness, creating sanctuaries where the Old One's vision of enlightened consciousness could continue to flourish regardless of what happened in the greater galaxy. The debates surrounding these proposals revealed the complete breakdown of the consensus that had previously unified Old One civilization. Groups that had worked together for millions of years found themselves unable to agree on fundamental questions about the nature of existence and their responsibilities as cosmic guardians. The careful balance of perspectives that had once generated wisdom through synthesis now produced only paralysis through irreconcilable contradiction. As these internal conflicts raged, the external situation continued to deteriorate at an accelerating pace. The Necron advance pressed forward with mechanical inevitability, consuming world after world in their systematic campaign to eliminate all organic life from the galaxy. The Citan grew ever more powerful as they fed on the life force of conquered civilizations, their influence spreading like a cancer through the fabric of reality itself. Visum, in the warp's churning depths, the entities that would one day be known as gods consolidated their power while preparing to make their presence felt in the material universe. They had learned to feed not just on the emotions generated by warfare and suffering, but on the very process of consciousness attempting to understand and respond to their influence. Every thought devoted to comprehending their nature, every moment of attention focused upon their activities, every instant of awareness dedicated to resisting their corruption served to strengthen their grip on reality. The Old Ones found themselves caught in a trap of their own making, unable to ignore threats that grew stronger through the very act of being observed and analyzed. Their attempts to study and understand their enemies only provided those enemies with additional power and influence, while their efforts to ignore or suppress knowledge of the corruption left them vulnerable to surprise attacks that exploited their ignorance. The situation had evolved beyond the possibility of victory in any conventional sense. The Old Ones could no longer hope to restore their galaxy to its previous state of ordered harmony, could no longer envision a future where consciousness developed along the benevolent paths they had spent millions of years encouraging. The best they could aspire to was some form of managed catastrophe, a controlled collapse that might preserve fragments of their civilization and the species they had created while minimizing the damage inflicted upon the universe as a whole. Even this limited goal seemed increasingly unattainable as the forces arrayed against them continued to grow in strength and sophistication. The warp entities had begun to display forms of coordination that suggested the emergence of higher-order intelligence among them, collective consciousness that could plan and execute strategies spanning multiple star systems and centuries of time. They were no longer mere parasites feeding on the emotions of organic beings, but active participants in the galaxy's transformation, entities with their own agendas and the power to implement them regardless of opposition from more conventional forms of life. The recognition that they were no longer the galaxy's dominant intelligence forced the Old Ones to confront the possibility that their time as cosmic guardians was ending through obsolescence rather than conquest. The universe was evolving beyond their ability to guide or control it, developing forms of existence that no longer required their wisdom or intervention. Their millions of years of stewardship had created the conditions for their own replacement by forms of consciousness that possessed all their power but none of their restraint or benevolence. In the growing darkness between the stars, where once their influence had brought light and order to countless worlds, new forms of awareness stirred with hungers that transcended anything the Old Ones had ever imagined. These entities viewed the galaxy not as a garden to be tended, but as a feast to be consumed, not as a community of diverse species to be guided toward mutual flourishing, but as a collection of resources to be exploited for their own incomprehensible purposes. The Age of Wisdom was ending, replaced by an era where power alone would determine the fate of consciousness throughout the cosmos. The careful balance between different forms of awareness that the Old Ones had maintained through patient guidance and gentle intervention was dissolving into a struggle for dominance, where only the strongest and most ruthless forms of consciousness would survive. The galaxy was entering a new phase of its existence, one where the very concepts of cooperation and mutual benefit would become alien to the beings that inherited the stars. As the last councils of their dying civilization debated options that ranged from desperate to impossible, the Old Ones began to understand that they were witnessing not just their own extinction, but the end of everything they had believed about the nature of consciousness and its potential for good. The universe was revealing itself to be far stranger and more hostile than they had ever imagined, a realm where awareness could become predatory, and intelligence could serve purposes that transcended any recognizable definition of sanity or benevolence. The gentle shepherds of galactic consciousness found themselves helpless observers of a transformation that would define the character of existence for millions of years to come, watching as forces beyond their comprehension took control of the cosmic drama they had once directed with such wisdom and care. Their greatest achievement, the cultivation of consciousness throughout the galaxy, had become the instrument of their ultimate defeat, turned against them by entities that possessed all the power of awareness but none of its redeeming virtues. In the final analysis, the Old Ones had succeeded too well in their mission to nurture consciousness, creating conditions that allowed awareness to evolve beyond their ability to guide or contain it. They had given birth to gods whose very existence made their own continued relevance impossible. Beings that would reshape reality according to principles that bore no resemblance to the gentle wisdom that had once illuminated the galaxy's path toward harmony and growth. The cosmos itself seemed to mourn the passing of an era as the last bastions of their ancient civilization prepared for an ending that would echo through eternity, leaving behind only fragments and memories of a time when consciousness had served the cause of creation rather than destruction. Thus ends the tale of the Old Ones, those ancient architects of consciousness whose gentle wisdom once guided the galaxy toward harmony and growth. In their rise and fall, we witness the fundamental tragedy of creation itself, that the greatest gifts can become the most terrible curses, that consciousness nurtured with love can evolve into forces of pure malevolence. Their legacy lives on in every conflict that tears the galaxy apart, every moment of suffering that feeds the dark gods they unwittingly birthed. As you drift towards sleep, remember that even in the grim darkness of the far future, the echoes of their noble intentions still whisper through the void.